Morning and welcome to the class. Today we're going to be talking about the pelvic tilt. Sometimes it's also referred to as tucking and untucking in a pose. And we're going to go over it. We're going to keep it super simple so that you can understand those concepts and then apply it to your poses. I think that there are so many students who have that question because while you're learning poses, you often hear an instruction to anteriorly tilt the pelvis or posteriorly tilt the pelvis or tuck and untuck in a pose. And in the midst of doing everything and getting familiar with the shapes, it can be very confusing. And a lot of this information can be misunderstood while you're learning a pose, or even, if you're in a more advanced kind of class and it's just too much information or delivered in a way that can cause misconceptions. And so the best way to learn this is to feel it in your body and to be under the guidance of a very good teacher who has knowledge in this, so that they can show you what mistakes that the body is making, because we're so used to having our shape in a certain way that it's hard to see sometimes the different movements that you have to do in order to create the change. So let's go over what that means to tuck, untuck, anterior or posterior tilt in a pose. And then after we just talk about it for a few minutes, I'm going to just show you different poses that you can do that are easy and accessible, that you can do to start learning this anterior and posterior tilt so that you can incorporate it in your poses correctly and possibly reduce a lot of back pain, a lot of overusing certain flexibilities in your muscles because other groups of muscles are tight, and so we put the strain on the groups of muscles that are not tight, and that can cause pretty painful results. And so knowing this is very important because it could prevent pain and injury and different kind of stress that you put on different parts of the body through your practice. So let's get into it. All right, so the posterior tilt and anterior tilt, let's describe those. And sometimes it takes a minute to get the definitions memorized and then to start feeling it in the body, and then eventually it becomes second nature, those terms. So I'm going to show you in my body. And so here we have the lumbar spine right here. And it has a natural lordosis, which means it has a natural curve here. So if you can see, I have, I can make my curve a little bit exaggerated, or I have a natural curve in my spine here. So when we talk about tilting the pelvis, anterior tilt or posterior tilt, we're actually never, ever going to flatten your back more than whatever the normal curvature of your back is. So it never means, tuck the pelvis or posterior tilt and flatten the back. So that is not a correct way to do this unless the teacher is very, very skilled and they have a particular thing that they want you to work on. But in a pose, in a class, or in your practice, you would never flatten your back. Okay, so we have the pelvis here. So we have our pelvic bone, and then we have the heads of the femur that come into the pelvis. And so this is really the rotation of the pelvis around the head of the femur. So it's not a movement of anything else, although we're all connected and everything moves, but really it's that rotation of here's the head of the femur and the hips going, moving around the head of the femur. So I have down here, I have the bottom part of my pubic bone, which is the pubic symphysis, and I have the hip bones right here. And so if I move the hip bones back, I tuck, right? So I have this, this movement here of tuck. So pubic symphysis comes up, hips come back. So that's the posterior tilt or a tucking. And then if I do the opposite, if I rotate my hips this way, I move the pubic symphysis back and I move the hips forward. So that's my anterior tilt or my untucking. Anterior tilt creates a back bend. Tucking or posterior tilt, so posteriors to the back, posterior tilt, creates more of a flattening sensation. And this is me exaggerating these movements. So the best thing to do is to do these movements and repeat the word so that you understand that untucking is going to create a back bend. Tucking is going to flatten the back. So take a little break, take a breath. We're going to get in the mat and we're going to go over this. Sometimes standing up is hard to feel, but when you get on the mat, it makes it much easier. And we're going to understand this and try to memorize this together. So one very word of caution too is we don't all have the same shape. Some bodies come more arched, maybe because of tightness, maybe because of just that's the natural healthy curvature of the back. So always check too with your doctor to see if your back, if you have damaged something in your back where it has to be in a certain shape. So some bodies are more tucked. Some bodies are definitely more untucked. And so it depends which body you got. And so if you have a tendency to arch your back more, and sometimes that arch is exaggerated because of tightness, then in the pose when you hear tucking, that may apply to you a little bit more than to someone who has a body that is naturally tucked. And so just by watching bodies walk around, you can notice that some people have a little bit more of a tuck. And so the untuck instruction is going to be sometimes a little bit more applicable to them. So it's in general, we tuck and untuck, but sometimes it doesn't apply to your body type because you already come a little extra tucked. Okay, so that's a good thing to keep in mind and to start. That's why it's not a general instruction for everybody. It's not one size fits all. And so that's why it's so important to check in, to understand these concepts, and then check in with the teacher so that you can apply it to your particular body in the correct way. So that's very important to remember. Okay, so let's get on the mat and start discovering our own normal curve of the back. Okay, so find a mat and go ahead and lay down on your back. Let's bring you closer so you can see. All right, here we are. So I am going to go over these things again, and let's lay down on the mat. Soften your eyes, your ears, and your throat. And you can put the feet down on the mat like this if this is comfortable, and knees together. And I'm going to take my hand out of the way for you, but you can keep your arms to your sides here. So when you press your feet down onto the mat, you have a little bit of control over your hips, so you can tuck and you can untuck. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can see this well through the screen. Let's get even closer. So we're going to use this terminology, tuck and untuck. Tuck is a posterior tilt. So here in the front of my pelvis, here I have my pelvic bone here, and in the front I have the pubic symphysis. Okay, so it's where the very front of the pelvis meets, and here I have my two hip bones, which is the bigger part of the pelvis here. So hip bones are coming back down into the ground. That's posterior tilt. So, and at the same time, the pubic symphysis comes up. So it's this rotation of the pelvis around the head of the femur. Okay, so tuck. Tuck, typically, if you do it too strongly, it'll flatten the back. So you want to very, very slowly untuck, right? This is this movement. So untuck creates an arch in your back if you overdo it, right? It'll arch the lower back. It'll push the pubic symphysis down onto the mat, and it'll bring the hip bones up. Okay, that is untuck. So we're going to get into how this affects your yoga poses in just a second, so stay tuned. So here we tuck, and we untuck. So just get familiar with this movement and start storing that information in your head. So tuck, untuck. This is what this looks like. Tuck, untuck. And at first, when we do this, we tuck with our chest and our eyes and our tongue and our hands, right? Eventually, it's just a very small movement that you're doing with the pelvis. And you're almost feeling that pelvis rotating around the head of the femur. And, the legs don't have to be involved, the upper chest. It's just this freedom of movement, this tucking. Okay. So now that you're getting familiar with this, do it about 5 times, softening the eyes, the ears, and the throat. So soften the eyes, take a deep breath, and then just don't do anything and keep the normal curve of your spine. If you can rest on the floor without doing any manipulations to it, see if there is a way that you can find out, is your tendency to arch a little bit more or to flatten towards the floor a little bit more. So take a breath, soften the eyes, the ears, and the throat, and you're going to tuck, which means you're going to bring the top of the hips down onto the mat. Pubic symphysis is going to kind of come up a little bit. And there's a sensation that there is a flattening of the lower back. Although you don't want to ever flatten the lower back towards the floor, don't injure yourself, but there is more of a lengthening sensation there. Flatten to the place where you can still maintain a lordosis in your lower back, the curve in your lower back. And then we're going to exhale, come back center, and then inhale, soften eyes, ears, and throat. And we bring the pubic symphysis down to the mat. We bring the hip bones away, okay, without moving the rib cage or anything like that. And that is an untuck or a anterior tilt, where you bring a little bit of an arch to the lower back. Softening the belly while you do this. So it's not movement or of this belly. This is a whole different class. It's really the core strength that can help you tuck and untuck. And okay. All right. So just to recap, we've seen that there is a movement of the hips of the pelvic bone around the head of the femur. It's not necessarily a movement of your rib cage, your chest, your hands, or your legs. It's just that rotation of the hips around the head of the femur. So if that rotation brings the hip bones back, then we're going to call it a posterior tilt or a tuck. And if that movement creates more of an arch in the back and moves so that the pubic symphysis goes back, the hip bones goes forward, then we're going to call that a untuck position, where we create more of a tuck, or an anterior tilt. Okay, so now we have the terminology. You felt it in your body a little bit. In order to understand this better in poses, let's do a few poses that can really show us how important it is to get the tucking and untucking in poses and why we do that. So we're going to first talk about the length of the quads. So the length of the quads, if you have very tight quads, is going to affect your ability to tuck and untuck. Also, hamstrings are going to affect that too. So the best thing that you can do to get ready for, any yoga pose is to start lengthening and giving yourself more length in the quad. So in a simple pose like a back bend, we usually hear the instruction to tuck the pelvis. So if you remember from what we just did on the mat, when you tuck the pelvis, it usually flattens the lower back a little bit, right? So if you untuck the pelvis, it creates an arch in the lower back. So you would think, why is it counterintuitive that you would tuck, meaning you would create more of a flatness versus an arch? tuck the pelvis in order to go into a back bend. And in fact, that is correct. You would tuck the pelvis to go into a back bend. And so why? Let's discover that in the pose. So I'm going to get into a pose that we call hero's pose, and even better, reclined hero's pose. So if I am to demonstrate this, but I'll explain first. So if I'm getting into a back bend and I really arch my back, I'm going to be doing this because if I have to overly arch my back is because usually I'm not engaging with the quad. So the quad is part of your back bend. And I'll show you how it's part of the back bend. So if I'm going into, right, so we need length in the front of the body to go into a back bend, and flexibility in the back and all of that. But flexibility in your legs is going to be a huge part of going into a comfortable back bend where you're not hurting your lower back. So how many times have we gone into a back bend and then you have a soft, sore lower back after that? Is because you're putting unnecessary amount of strain there, possibly because your quads are tight. And so if I go into, let's just say, a supported back bend, and here I am preventing my pelvis to tuck. To untuck too much, right? So I can untuck and then I can tuck. So untuck and tuck. Okay, so what I want is I want to increase the length of my quad in order to go into the back bend, right? So here you see if I have flexibility in the quad, it's not just the work of my lower back, but also the length in my quad. And if I could bring my knee all the way to the floor, not by arching the back, but by this length of this muscle, then you can see how the back bend is a lot more well distributed in terms of where am I bending, right? So you bend in the lower back, of course, but also this length is needed. Okay, so here, if I am untucking too much, meaning if I'm creating too much of a lower back bend here, I tuck the pelvis and I say, okay, I need to get into this back bend by the length of my quad instead of by really taxing the lower back and creating a bend just here. So the bend is of that, okay? So I tuck in a back bend and I increase the length of the quad and I come into a much healthier and safe back bend. So how do we get this length of the quad? So one great way to do it, is to practice reclining hero's pose. So let's get into and look at what that pose looks like. Okay, so if I get into hero's pose, I'm going to use a little bit of support for my back. And I'm going to do that by just putting these blocks down, and I can put the height, I can increase the height here. Okay, so I'm going to add a little height there for myself. And I'm going to come into this pose where I put I come into hero's pose. And I'll show you that in more detail in just a second. And I'm going to come into one-sided hero's pose. Okay, making sure that my hips here are parallel with the floor. I'm going to come back and recline on my hero's pose. Okay, and so one leg in the floor, and I'm laying back in this pose. And I feel really the stretch of my quad. If I'm sitting and into this pose and I am arching the lower back, then here you can understand that I need to rotate the hip bones towards the floor. The pubic symphysis is up, so I need to create this work so that I stretch the quad more. So if I am arching my lower back in this pose, okay, if I'm creating an anterior tilt or a untucking position of my lower back, I have to understand, is this, I'm not trying to get into the pose where I do this, I create this arch, because it's the pose that I want to get into. There's a pose where I do this, but it's actually, if I'm into reclining hero's pose and my back arches, usually is because there is tightness in the quad, and my lower back that is more flexible is making up for that. So what do I have to do here is I have to lift that knee, and I have to bring my hips into the mat. I have to lift my pubic symphysis up and rotate the hips around the head of the femur so that my back is not artificially arching. Okay, so I have to tuck or posterior tilt in this pose. And then slowly I have to work on this length. And the way that I do that is I lay on this pose, removing the arch. So if I can't help it, there's still an arch. What I do is I add more height, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So when you see your body doing that, creating that arch in this pose, is because the body is compensating for the tightness in the quads by arching the back. So what we do is we lift, give ourselves a little bit more support. We lift up from the ground, and then we work on lengthening the quad versus arching the back, which will never allow you to lengthen that quad, because you're just compensating for that tightness as a way of cheating in the pose. Here we go. So I'm going to do this, right? So I added some height here for myself, and I come back here onto the pose. I sit in Virasana, which is, I'm going to do it one leg at a time. Bring the left leg back, sit on a height here. All right, so I'm much more comfortable. This is what it looks like from the back. Okay. So I am sitting here, and you can add more height if you need to. And even here, you start feeling a little bit of stretch in the quads already. Before laying back, lift the knee, place it on a support. Okay, and here we can add the same height that we have here. So add the knee to the support. Okay, and then we're going to place the sacrum onto the block here. Okay, so sacrum into the block. Then right up on my chest line here in the back, I put the support and then my head. So now you can see I have a much healthier ability to stretch the quad without arching the back. So bring the foot that's not in the pose, the right foot down on the ground, push that foot onto your mat, and tuck the pelvis here. So bring the foot onto the mat, and here you're going to be doing a little bit of an arch. Bring the hip bones back, really rotating the pelvis so that the pubic symphysis comes up, the hips come down, and then soften the belly, lift the chest, and breathe. And then if you let go, I don't know if you can see that, the pelvis sort of bounces back into its arched position because the thigh is so tight, it's pulling it, right? Pulling it. So then we press this bottom foot onto the mat, tuck the pelvis, soften the belly, soften the eyes, the ears, and the throat. And this is the work. And then you can bring your foot here, your opposite foot onto the leg. You can place it against the wall, and you can really stretch the quad here at the same time, tucking the pelvis. And what does it mean to tuck? Rotate the hips around the head of the femur so that the pubic symphysis, which is this bottom part, comes up towards the ceiling, and the hip bones come down towards the floor. So it's this rotation here. And it's a very, very strong, wonderful stretch. And you can add more height if you need it for this laying down, or if you have a little bit more flexibility, you can lay down closer to the floor. So this is a really great pose to do at any time, really. It's a pose that will relax your nervous system. It will lengthen your quad. It will teach you how to posteriorly and anteriorly check in with your pelvis and see what's going on. What is it, the tightness of the quad that's causing me to untuck? So go ahead and tuck, loosen the abdominal muscles. This is also a great exercise to start engaging the core and tucking using the pelvic floor, not the abdominal muscles. And lifting the chest. So this is, practice in itself. And you can do this, a few minutes every day. This pose not only helps you to really start learning about this tucking and untucking and improving your back bends, improving standing poses, bringing calmness to the nervous system, but it also improves the quality of your feet, of your ankle, and of your shins. So if you have shin splints and that kind of thing, it's a really, really great pose for that. So I definitely recommend this pose in the beginning. I would lay in this pose every day, and then I would do Shavasana. So that was my yoga practice. So if you need more help, or if you have different kinds of challenges getting into this pose, because it's very strong, feel free to ask a teacher or to send comments below. And I can try to help you if I can from here. And I'll show you what the pose looks like if you can get on the floor and do it on the floor. Right. So don't hurt your knees. So this pose, if the knees are hurting, go back to adding a little bit more height. Okay, and then you would do the second side, of course, but I will show you on the right side. So get in the pose. So first step is we bring the knee up so that we don't overstretch the quads too much and damage the knee. Okay, so you can put a block there. It's a placeholder if you have to. And come down here into the pose, and then take a few breaths here. And when you're ready, go ahead and remove the block. And we don't think bring the knee down. You think bring the knee out towards the floor. So you really lengthen this leg. And as you bring the leg down, or as the knee comes down, I should say, because you really are if there was someone here adding pressure to your knee, I'd be trying to push my knee into my foot, So, okay, so right foot onto the mat, push the knee out, and see if it comes down versus this, right? So incorrect, where this is cheating, and then the correct movement. Okay, let's see if I can bring that closer, and if you can see that better. Okay, so let's get into the pose. All right, so here I have the knee going towards the floor, the right foot pushing down onto the mat so that I tuck, right? So I'm going to show you the incorrect action would be bring the knee down by arching the hips. So this would be the incorrect. Okay, so here I can see there's a lot of tightness in the quad. The back is taking the heat for it, and there's no extra length being developed here at all. So this is just the cheating way to do it. Now I bring my spine back to neutral. You can see I'm not overly arching here, and I'm going to try to lengthen the quad. So this is what this looks like. So I keep the pubic bone, my pelvic bone, pushing down onto the mat, the pubic symphysis coming up. So I am tucking, okay, posteriorly tilting. And I lengthen, see, without arching, I lengthen that leg, this muscle, pushing the knee towards the wall in front of me. I lengthen, and then I hold my tuck. I keep tucking, keep tucking, keep tucking. I make sure that I am tucking. I'm not doing that. And that's the work of lengthening the quad versus just using the flexibility of the lower back. So that's what I'm going to do in a back bend too. I'm going to lengthen the quad and not overtask the lower back, and then practice a much safer back bend. Okay. And then when I'm ready, come up and do the same thing on the second side. It's better to come into this pose sitting up with the block. But same thing, this foot pushes down, and then you can lengthen the quad versus, okay. All right, so this is all the time we have. Hopefully this class was insightful and it kind of illustrated a little start of understanding this concept of tilting the pelvis, posterior and anterior tilt. And usually when we are asked to tilt the pelvis one way or another, is to override the automatic tendency of the body to do, to protect a muscle that's tight by overarching or using some other part of the muscle that may be a little bit more flexible. So we counter that by doing the right movement, by saying, no, I want to actually stretch the part that's tight versus just, freezing it and not doing anything about it. So we took a look at how to do the posterior and anterior tilt today on a back bend, and what pose to work on to make sure that we start working on it. So I hope that you enjoyed it. Please send me comments below with any questions or any suggestions. And I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And I'll see you next week here on the live stream on YouTube. Okay, thank you so much. Bye.